For those who worked for rich people, what is the most out-of-touch thing you witnessed? Story 1. I had a rich friend in grade school, and one day I was at her house and her mom had done a load of whites laundry. She threw away all the clean socks and said she'd just buy more because she didn't feel like pairing them up. I was in 8th grade and was like, WTF. Story 2. A local notorious billionaire had a McLaren Senna craned up to his $40 million apartment during peak COVID in Melbourne, Austin, currently refusing to pay trades for the apartment renovations. Whole thing is a shoot show. My friend did some work at the apartment. Story 3. Yeah, a girl I knew thought the ATM was just a money printer for everyone and was confused why people worked if they could just go get more. Story 4. I nannied for an extremely wealthy family. Several times a month, they would send me on an errand to Neiman Marcus to pick up the 13-year-old's next shopping haul from their personal shopper. These batches of clothing were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars each, and they were designer clothes that looked appropriate for a 50, 60-year-old woman who worked in a conservative corporate environment. The kicker is the girl wore sweatpants and sweatshirts every single day. So this stuff just piled up in her massive closet. I used to look at the items and think about how, one skirt cost more than I made in a month, and I made good money there. Also, the dad paid someone to come and clip his toenails, specifically. Story 5. She had a concierge service. Whatever she needed, she just called a number, and they made it happen. Anything from a private flight to having a full suite of camping equipment delivered in less than 2 hours and packed in her car so she could escape for the weekend and unplug. When she got back, she called the same number, and an hour later, the equipment was gone from her trunk, and the car was detailed. By ghosts, apparently, because they were so invisible. She also had her pool cleaned before 6 a.m. because she disliked seeing the guys in the yard. It scared her to see strangers. Story 6. I was in a house in a gated community in Newport Beach, CA. It was one of the most expensive communities in OC. After I had already arrived, the woman living had guests coming. She was maybe mid-50s. Hard to say because she clearly had work done on her days. The guests were 3 high school girls, and it appeared she was mentoring them. It was the first time they met. After greeting and introduction, one girl asked, "How was your day?" The woman answered, "Oh, it was busy. I went to the gym. I had my nails done. It was already 3 p.m. Story 7. Architect, working in high-end residential for the point one. Couple thoughts. Clients have never been to a grocery store. Kitchen and fridges fully stocked before walking into their newly completed home, likely their 3rd, 5th home. $700K custom fabricated wine room for a couple that doesn't drink. Her closet twice the size of my condo, and still not big enough. Almost all are preppers for end-of-the-world economy scenarios with backup micro power plants, guns for hunting game, and yet none know how to cook for themselves without their personal chef. Story 8. I was an IT intern for some Catholic church priest who wore a lot of jewelry and dressed very luxuriously. Basically, they owned a huge amount of land and had everything they wanted, seemingly funded by the church. The thing is, they never spoke to me or even looked at me. The rule was that if I had to check why the Wi-Fi was not working in an area and they entered, I had to leave. The people who were allowed to talk to them referred to them as Your Reverence and other similarly ridiculous titles. Story 9. When I played football in high school, there was a guy who would throw away his socks and boxers and wear new ones after practice. Every day, after every practice and game, a new pair. If his clothes were dirty, he threw them away too. He always had new stuff with him. Crazy stuff. Story 10. The owner of my company had a house so big that nobody knew that the roof collapsed in a portion of the home. They never went into that wing and had no clue until an HVAC technician serving the AC noticed it. Answer. A similar thing happened to my friend, but not because he was rich. When he was in college, he had a distant uncle who lived nearby to campus. So he would occasionally visit to help this guy out and have an excuse to leave campus occasionally. During his senior year, his uncle died and left the house to him. It was a huge house, old family mansion or something. So my friend stayed in it for his last year and then sold it when he graduated. The entire time he lived there, he only really used 2 rooms, one of the bedrooms and a living room. When he was selling the place, it was found out that in one of the rooms, on the side of the house that he never went to, had one of the windows broken at some point, and animals had been basically living in it. Turns out squirrels were stashing nuts in it, and one had fallen in a crack in the floorboard and started sprouting. So they discovered a room that had a tree growing in it. It's fascinating how someone can drop hundreds of thousands on a vehicle, but find a small fine for parking it incorrectly to be a personal insult. It really shows how some people value their money differently when it comes to rules that apply to everyone else. Story 11. private jet world, you would have 2, maybe 3 identical private jets on the ramp. A married couple would pull up in separate cars with their other boyfriend or girlfriend in the passenger seat in front of other said wife or husband. Kids would pull up with the nanny in another car, then decide if they are riding in mom's jet or dad's jet and just hop in and go. Then the luggage and various things the family bought would get shoved sometimes in a third jet just as cargo. Never seen so much fudge you money in my life. Story 12. Owner of the company I worked at held weekly meetings with office staff. Not very productive, usually just a chance for him to rant randomly about things. First day he was back from a 3-week family vacation to Italy, paid for by the struggling company, was meeting day. He spent an hour lecturing us that we weren't being good parents if we didn't take our kids to Europe and let them experience the world, then proceeded to demand answers for why locations didn't flow cash the previous month when they paid for said vacation. Half the people in the meeting made less than $20 an hour, and of them resigned the next day. Story 13. Our roommate was sweet and down to earth, but absolutely clueless in weird ways. We had come up with a chores rotation plan where we'd get a room for the week, look after it. Garbage was its own chore. She had garbage, which was basically the main bin in the kitchen, that had to be brought out to the larger bin outside, then rolled to the curb on garbage day. On garbage day, we didn't understand why the kitchen bin was overflowing with tied-up trash bags and not outside. She thought the trash collectors came inside to pick up. Story 14. We were driving, and they exclaimed, "I don't know why people just stand there beside the road." And I replied, "That's the bus stop." Story 15. The best I witnessed. Their friend called and said that they just bought a house in Costa Rica and asked them to buy the one next door. They called their agent and spent millions with just a phone call. Answer. My dad worked as a government employee in a very affluent town for years, NYC suburb. This story took place in the mid-90s to put the amounts in perspective. A guy, Jack, bought a beachfront property for $4 million for his wife and kids in this town. He liked it, but like many beachfront properties, it didn't have a ton of land, and Jack didn't like his neighbor being so close. Felix was his neighbor. Felix had lived in the property for over 40 years. Wife had passed, kids were grown. It was really too much house for him. Jack and Felix got to know each other, and Jack asked Felix, when he did decide to sell, to give Jack the right of first refusal. Felix agreed, and sure enough, about a year later, Felix mentioned he wanted to sell. He named a price, $4 million, and Jack agreed. Deal was quite literally done on a handshake. Felix got himself settled in his new home, the deal closed, and the following day, Jack submitted a request for a demo permit for Felix's house, which was granted. Jack spent $4 million for an acre of beachfront property. Really more, because demo is crazy. Story 16. I used to work in a security company that catered to some of the filthiest, richest people on the planet in the North County, San Diego County area. Rancho Santa Fe, La Jolla, Del Mar, and some other disgustingly rich areas. 1. Doing walkthroughs for a security proposal, and the homeowner who has lived there for 10 years discovered new bathrooms and bedrooms they were not aware they had, outdoor fixtures, gardens they don't remember putting in. I once had a client that forgot he had an entirely different wine stockhouse in his second basement full of high-value rare wines. 2. A client asked what kind of car I drove, and I said Ford Ranger, and he thought I said Range Rover, and proceeded to talk about how he preferred one model of Land Rover over the other, and how he is thinking of picking up a third. 3. It was not uncommon to work on deals over lunch or a cocktail. They would order whatever they wanted, and I would usually order a soda, but these places did not have soda. They had soda water with lime or Perrier with lime or whatever. They would always ask why I was not drinking with them, and I would have to explain that I'm at work and I have a gun on my hip and I am in uniform. I'd be sweating over the menu because nothing has a dollar value on it, and so I would order chicken whatever, and they would get annoyed with me, but then if I ordered something nice, they would make some annoying comment. 4. Second-generation wealth was almost always out of touch. From what common folk cared about or did for fun to what we ate, drove, where we lived, etc. First-generation wealth was the guy-girl that could talk to you and be at your level and be respectful and be kind and aware to protect you from embarrassment. Comparing the cost of a single flight to the price of a permanent residence is definitely a level of financial reality that most of us will never experience. It's one of those moments where the scale of wealth just completely distorts any normal sense of value. Story 17. I grew up with close friends in gated communities and 2 to 5M homes. Best friend had an aunt and uncle with a 10M home in Crestkill. NJ and I got to know them very well. It's clear all of these families were filthy rich, but conversely to all the comments, there was not a single instance where they acted out of touch. All of them were hardworking, down-to-earth, caring, and normal. They all lived below their means. There were differences, of course. Different levels of vacations, gifts, purchases, etc. I worked from the moment I turned 14. My friends didn't work until they were seniors in high school. Not even sure why they did then, but they weren't out of touch. Not everyone who is rich is a jerk, even those who grow up knowing nothing else. Answer, my sister dated a very nice guy when she was in her late teens, early 20s, and his family was extremely rich, worth hundreds of millions. But you'd never guess it if you met them. You could tell they were well off, but they weren't flashy. But yes, different vacations and gifts. One time my sister was in Europe with them, and the mum casually comes out of a Chanel shop with a pair of flats for her, saying they were the most comfortable shoes ever. Story 18. I was working overnights at a fancy timeshare, and a guest complained about his friend buying a new jet just to brag that it was better than his. I was like, wow, that's cool. I have to decide if I want food or electricity this week. Thanks for the two for parking your car. Story 19. Did an addition for a family that had a full-time housekeeper. I would leave on Friday evening and a used paper towel would be on the floor. It would still be there on Monday morning when I returned. Answer, friend of mine was a housekeeper for a wealthy family of 5 mom, dad in their 40s, 3 teenage kids. Friend was working 4 to 5 hours a day, MF, just cleaning, making beds, and doing laundry. One time she took a week off. When she came back, the house was a disaster. There were empty toilets, paper rolls under the toilet paper holder, despite each bathroom having a trash can, and a new full roll sitting on top of the empty one that's still in the holder. Nobody had wiped the countertops in the kitchen. Dirty clothes on the floor, too difficult to put into the laundry basket. But the best was the wife, who had a habit of pulling her pants off together with her underwear and leaving the pants on the floor, wherever she took them off in the bedroom, bathroom, or closet, inside out, with the underwear still attached, for my friend to pick up and put in the laundry basket and wash. Story 20. I work at a shop that deals with very high-end stereo equipment and have had to gently explain to a significant number of people, all older white guys, that my role as a clerk does not compensate well enough for me to be able to give nuanced opinions about the relative merits of various 1050K pieces of boutique audio gear. I have a 15-year-old mid-grade Yamaha receiver at home. Story 21. As an artist, I have extremely wealthy people ask me for discounts regardless of how much the art costs. It's sport to them, but it's a utility bill payment or a month's rent for me. I've had someone ask for a discount on a 120 painting when they probably spend more than that on craft cocktails and appetizers. Every sale is a good sale, but it always makes me like them a little less. Answer, I used to help a friend of mine photograph Islamic weddings. These families would fly over famous singers from Bangladesh or India to do private concerts at a wedding, but spend weeks haggling for discounts off his very reasonable photography fee. I'd love to know how this works in their heads. Maybe it's because my friend was providing a service and not status. I have no idea. It's his culture, and visually, these long, colorful weddings are a joy as a photographer. But the amount of times he would be relentlessly haggled made him go for a different customer base. Story 22. After a couple years working at my current job, I noticed the owner of the business would get a brand new truck every half year or so. When I asked why, she said the tires were getting worn down, so it was time for a replacement. Cries and monthly payments. Story 23. Mine was a kind of second order, out of touch comment. I used to work for a company that was run by a multi-billionaire, and I would have to go to his multiple homes to ensure that the technology was working correctly. One of the senior traders asked me about what his houses were like, and when I told him, he said, wow, it's just a different world, isn't it? I know for a fact this senior trader at the time made around $3 million a year. I guess technically that the guy making $3 million is closer to me than the billionaire, but I still found it extraordinarily out of touch. Ironically enough, the billionaire guy was always pretty normal. Story 24. I built a $40 million house for a billionaire. They changed so many things, and it would be after we bought all of the finishes. We had 3 storage units full of stuff that they had bought and then didn't use. A 9,000 stove was the biggest item I can think of. The thing has been in storage for 2 years. Just wasteful. Answer, that's how my brother got his custom 10K Italian stove. Contractor friend of my dad's ordered it for a client who didn't like the color it was that she picked. Ordered a new one with another 6-month lead time, And he asked her what to do with the old one, and she said just get rid of it. But he didn't really have anywhere to store it. It's crazy wide, so it's not like you just put it in a standard kitchen. My brother happened to be buying a house right at that time, and he had the builder alter the plan's countertops to fit this giant jerk stove in there. Story 25. I was a caddy at one of the most expensive golf clubs in the country, $450,000 initiation fee, plus a $50,000 membership fee per year. Most of the members were insanely nice and genuinely showed interest in who you are and your life goals. However, I remember being part of a four-ball with two couples, the members and their friends. The husband had a heart attack and had to be med-flighted off island to a better hospital. He lived and is okay. The wife called the restaurant they were all supposed to have dinner at that evening and verbatim says, "Hey, I will need to change our reservation. My husband had a heart attack and won't be joining us. It will now just be for 3, thank you." Absolutely insane. Story 26. CEO laid off 1,000 people and cried because it was very traumatic. The next week, he did an interview in the local paper talking about the 30,000 square foot climate-controlled addition to his home to use as a museum for his collection of historical artifacts, and the several $100,000 he spent on real cherry wood paneling instead of the cheap stuff that's just done in a cherry stain. Story 27. I wouldn't say work it for, but I've had rich patients from time to time, and some of them really struggle with the concept that some things can't be solved with money. Story 28. I dated a girl who, at 25, didn't know how to use the washing machine at my house. I asked how she'd never used one. She said, "I don't know. That's what the people do." The people? Yeah, like the helpers at the house. Answer. An acquaintance of mine once told me about how he had to learn all these new things when he got to Ivy League college. Like he had never once cleaned his own room and talked about figuring it out as if it were a calculus problem. He has a never-ending stream of money from his family. He has started a few unsuccessful business ventures and now gives liqueurs and speaks at conferences about entrepreneurship. He lists all the businesses he founded, never mentions that they're little more than just a Squarespace website that lists him and some friends as consultants. He never mentions that he comes from generational wealth, so be careful who you take advice from. Story 29. Worked on 2 houses being built for a couple in a very nice area. A fantastic house and a somewhat, but only somewhat, more modest house. I was a subcontractor, and I got to speak with the lady of the house one afternoon. "Why 2 houses?" says I. "Oh," she says, "we have 2 houses all over the country. You never know who the kids are going to bring home with them. So they all stay in that house and we stay in this one." Of course. Story 30. I used to work for a billionaire, real billionaire, not startup bro type, and I had a late lunch meeting with him, and they brought his food in a gold plate with gold cutlery. He asked me if I wanted something for lunch. I said, "No, I'm good." I had never seen a person eating from an actual gold plate before. Story 31. A friend used to breed, supply, and train hawks for super rich Arabs. One day he got a call and asked if he was willing to go to the Range Rover factory and act as hawk consultant to the car designers, as his client wanted basically a desert hunting Range Rover, single throne in the back that rose up with room for 6 hawks. One good thing was that the welfare of the hawks was as important as the comfort of the client, and all the features he asked for was completed, even if it required some serious thinking on behalf of the engineers. Story 32. I am a caretaker for an elderly woman in her private home. Her son recently has had some health problems, and I have been helping him out at well. He had some operations and couldn't walk very much, so he kept ordering delivery food. Well, he kept having issues with his orders and was fed up, but asked me, "What can I even eat? I can't cook. I don't want more delivery." I went out and bought him stuff to make sandwiches. Bread, bunch of meats, cheeses, toppings, condiments. He called me almost crying about how happy he was he can make his own food now. Story 33. I used to do triathlons. I worked for a HNWI, and when I told him I hadn't had success finding a local gym with a swimming pool, he suggested I join a country club. He knew how much I was making too. Story 34. Their kids, when each turned 18, got a McMansion in the same fancy hood just for themselves. Like I'm struggling to buy a home after years of savings, and they just get one as a rite of passage. And that's all I can say. Story 35. I piloted a launch for a yacht club on Cape Cod, which means I would take a Boston Whaler 19 friend out to moored yachts, pick up visiting yachtsmen and their guests, and bring them to the yacht club for events, dinners, etc. during regattas. Most of them were very nice, tipped well and of good humor, and of course had gorgeous yachts, which I often admired. One of the yachtsmen was quite friendly, and we ended up on a first-name basis with one another. I saw him for the first regatta of the season, but the next time I saw him, it was plainly obvious that he had purchased a new yacht, which was even more impressive than his last. I complimented him on it, and he took me aside and asked me not to gush over it in front of his wife. It turned out that, due to a recent illness, she had difficulty boarding his last yacht, so he replaced it with this one, which was much easier for her to board. Really nice guy and super sweet of him to do for the love of his life, and the dude just plonked down 2M on a new yacht. Story 36. Out-of-town work trip. Rental cars were picked over at the airport, all compact cars. They went and purchased an Escalade because they were frustrated with the rental car situation. Escalade was left at their in-laws' house a few hours away for use on future trips. Coworker drove the Escalade there and Ubered to the airport. They were great people to work for, just living in a whole different world. Story 37. In a conversation with a friend who had a rich girl that was going out with her friend, she was asked if she wanted to come along to a concert. When my friend said no because she didn't have money for it, the girl said, "Just go to the bank to get some." She thought everyone had millions sitting in the bank for their use. Story 38. Lived with one. He had at least a 6-car garage and 2 were designated for Christmas decorations. His hobby was buying houses in poorer neighborhoods. He would complain about how much stuff his tenants had. Oh, and he and his wife, only he and his wife, lived in a 5,000 SF house while I rented a room above their detached garage. Story 39. At the start of COVID lockdowns, one of the partners at a huge accounting firm could not understand how not everyone could just turn one of their rooms into a home office. Story 40. Private jet en route from Michigan to Eastern Long Island. 12-way there, she realized she forgot the dress she intended to pack for the party she intended to go to. Had the pilot turn around to go back to Michigan for her party dress. I'm sure that was worth it. Story 41. They paid for their own dumpster weekly pickup because they ordered so much stuff online and their trash cans supplied by the city couldn't fit everything. It was a family of 3, and the dumpster was always full. Story 42. My girlfriend worked for someone wealthy who owned her own business. My GF was saying she needs to get fitter. Her boss told her to just buy a Peloton and to come to her fitness spa retreat in Greece. My GF replied, "You literally know how much you pay me, and it's nowhere enough to afford any of that." This caused the rift, and the boss was horrible to her from then on. Story 43. Have a friend whose boss had pool drained and retiled, and then didn't like the color of the tile with water in the pool, thus had the pool drained and retiled again. Both sets of tiles were imported from Europe. Story 44. He was the CEO at the time. Retail. This was after the worst of COVID. During COVID, they had discovered that they could run the stores on skeleton crews, 2 to 3 people for a whole day. We used to have 5, 6 for a whole day. This was stressing people out, as they still expected all the tasks to be done. We cut a bunch of the less critical tasks per day, but there's still customers, compliance stuff, keeping records, etc. A colleague of mine confronted him about this during a visit, saying we were understaffed and that people were getting stressed out with all the extra work, and that we had people on the books, but weren't being given the hours necessary to maintain the stores. His response was, "Well, that's just your perception. No fuckface. It's our experience." Basic life skills can sometimes be completely bypassed when you've had staff covering every need since birth. It's a strange thought to imagine reaching adulthood without ever having to press a button on a microwave or understand how a toaster works. Story 45. At the previous company I worked for, our division director, making 400, 500K year base, not super rich, but well off for a single guy, never did laundry. He basically bought all brand new socks, t-shirts, undershirts, underwear every single week. Everything else was dry cleaned and taken care of by his housekeeper. Story 46. I worked in a building with 2 companies. My company was owned by the son. The other company was owned by the father. The father asked me what I was going to do for vacation. I really wanted to tell him, "Your son does not pay me enough to afford a vacation." Story 47. Taking a midday nap is essential for health. You really need to start doing that. Yes, I'd love to take a nap in the middle of the day, but I have this little thing called a job that gets in the way. Story 48. A customer once told me to avoid a certain type of plane if I was ever shopping for one. He was a pretty interesting guy and told me a lot about planes because he works on them, but that part was pretty funny. Story 49. When we were 16 or 17, my rich friend was tasked by her dad to buy her grandmother a nice handbag for her birthday. My friend brought me along on the shopping trip, Along with the handbag, she put a 200 watch on her dad's credit card for herself, thinking her dad wouldn't notice. He eventually noticed and told her it's an early Christmas present. LOL. Story 50. I worked for a high-end residential general contractor in Manhattan for a short time. One client, spending millions to renovate their Union Square apartment, was fussing over specs for her new custom kitchen cabinets. She said she didn't like seeing the row of holes for adjustable shelving inside cabinets. She only wanted her shelves placed exactly where she wanted them inside the cabinets, so there would be no extra holes. Story 51. I worked at a private airfield, the ones where we would valet the cars for the rich passengers. One time when an older lady flew back in and we brought up her new Range Rover, she freaked out and said it wasn't her car and that she couldn't believe we lost her car. I went back to review the security tape and see what car she drove up to the plane and try to trace it that way. The passenger was yelling at the front desk that she couldn't believe how inept we were and that she was thinking about suing us if we couldn't find her car. Cue her assistant calling to see how the flight was. The passenger was telling her assistant how we lost her car when the assistant reminded her she bought that Range Rover just before she left for her trip. The passenger then immediately remembered and haphazardly apologized as she walked out the door to the new car. Imagine being so rich that you forgot you bought a brand new car. Story 52. I worked for someone who owned sports teams. He had his helicopter land on a youth sports field while he ran in for meetings and a bunch of kids' games had to be canceled because of it. Story 53. I once had a boss genuinely ask why people didn't just buy a starter apartment in the city instead of renting. Like she fully thought dropping a few hundred thousand was the same as buying a couch. No irony, no joke. Story 54. Didn't work with him, but in college my roommate got offended when I told him I couldn't go on a multi-flight tour with him to Africa. I was like, dude, I need to work all summer to afford anything next year. I couldn't even buy the ticket if I wanted to. Kid was flabbergasted that my parents couldn't just fund a summer-long trip for me. Story 55. I worked as a lifeguard for a rich family, 7 days a week, 8 hours a day in the summer. The kids would go to summer camp for 6 weeks in the summer. The husband worked 9 to 5 every day, and the wife would drive around all day calling people on the phone when they first came out. They would buy new cars every 2 years. The husband hit a curb with a 3-month-old car and got a flat tire. Instead of having the flat changed, he called the dealer and had a new car delivered to where the other one was disabled. Answer? Ha ha ha. I met a couple families like that at a Mercedes-Benz dealer I worked at. Brand new cars every 2 years, all paid for and owned family name trust. There were 6 of them, and they only worked with one sales guy. And every time they came to pick up a new car, he'd be up, my jerk, making sure it was spotless and prepped right because he didn't want to lose a guaranteed 60-90K sale every couple months. Story 56. I worked security in luxury hotels for a long time, so I've got a lot of these. The one that comes to mind right now is when a guy crashed his new BMW SUV into a light pole on our property, which not only knocked it down, but also took out 2 of our security cameras mounted on it. When we approached him, he just gave us insurance info and walked off to have a picnic with his girlfriend. Story 57. I once waited on Carlos Santana and his wife while the owner of the restaurant that I worked at tried to wine and dine them in hopes of working out a licensing agreement and opening a chain of Santana-themed restaurants. Carlos and his wife were absolute sweethearts. The restaurant owner's wife asked for her coffee drink after dinner, yet was absolutely incapable of explaining what she wanted. I ran around the restaurant for 10 minutes asking anyone I could think of what it might be that she wanted. If memory serves, it was something stupid like a latte with extra foam. I was dumbfounded that a 40-year-old woman would not know how to order a latte yet still be confident that it would magically appear when she wanted it. Story 58. I was early 20s and took my brother-in-law's friend's parents out for lunch while they were visiting the city I lived in. As a favor, they had a high-end hotel suite as their base, which they didn't check out of while they were traveling, staying around the country for a few months. They wanted a home away from home between trips. They had several sets of their favorite brand of sheets, pillows, and duvets sent to the hotel exclusively for their stay. They didn't realize a Vineyard was a 2.5-hour drive from one of the lodges they were staying at. A waiter mentioned it to them at dinner. They asked the hotel concierge to organize a helicopter for the next morning, which they did. I spoke about how my city had one of the highest house prices relative to incomes in the world, to which they suggested buying a house in one of the most expensive suburbs in the country because it seemed quaint and cheap and a good way to quickly get on the ladder. Houses started around the $2 million mark, and I was earning like $80K. In hindsight, I shouldn't have paid for lunch. Story 59. This family would go on regular shopping sprees for their young kids. I was tasked with cutting all the tags out of the clothes because the kids didn't like how they felt. Cutting a tag out of a 600 Burberry sweater for a 5-year-old felt insane. Story 60. Didn't work for him, but bought some furniture off of a guy who told me, a new and broke Alina student, that buying a 500 mattress wasn't anything to think about because he had a 1,000 mortgage. Fudge you, Greg. Story 61. Didn't work for them, but I was walking my very handsome dog through a fancy area of town, and a young, very expensively dressed tourist child was smitten with him. Does he travel with you? She asked. Like, in the car? Yeah, he does, I said. Clearly frustrated, the girl said, no, like in the plane. Story 62. Worked in there for a small company. Owner's 20-something. Kid was with us at an event. We get to talking, and he's excited that I know what Bitcoin is and geeking that I have a nano wallet. Think of it as a bank account you own that's on a USB stick. Anyways, he loads up his wallet, 1.3 M on screen. He then asks how much I have in mine, how many different coins am I buying, had maybe 3K or so. He said that was far too little, and I should ask my parents to put at least 50K in. I pat him on the back and said, Jimmy me's salary here isn't even that much. He froze, and I genuinely think a light bulb went off because he shut the laptop down and quickly left the room. Was super nice to me after that, though, LOL. Story 63. I have recently been working with a really lovely woman downsizing an estate. She was leaving a vast majority of the furniture and artwork behind as she didn't want to bother moving it. Some key highlights. 1. A painting worth about 3K that she really didn't want, but didn't want to bother selling. So it is sitting behind in the garage as I could not bring myself to throw it out. I gave away about 10 others, lesser value. 2. Giving away dinner sets worth about 1K each because we just needed them gone. 3. Costume jewelry, eerie, bumi swelling, in the bottom of the drawer, and the scrappy bits of broken stuff, it being bundled up and worth 4.5K, I took it to a gold buyer on her behalf. 3. Having to try to convince her to let me give away brand new excess items, and her being utterly flabbergasted that people would drive to the estate to pick them up. It was incomprehensible that someone would come and pick up 150 worth of cleaning products, etc. I had to get her over the line, allowing people to come onto the property. Lovely woman, not that out of touch, but certainly when you have sold a property for that much, little details like this become tedious. Story 64. I worked as a guide at a dude ranch in western Montana that was extremely expensive. It was 5K a night to stay in some of the nicer cabins, and lots of rich and famous people stayed. Well-known actors, political figures, coaches and players from NBA, NHL, MLB, and NFL, that sort of thing. Some of the most out-of-touch things involved wildlife and the use of recreational vehicles. There was a large boar grizzly that frequented the ranch, and after spotting him, multiple people tried to follow him into the woods and feed him pizza at a 4th of July party we had before staff intervened. We had wild elk and moose on the property, and a livestock bison herd as well that people treated like pets and would get way too close to, try to feed pet, and in one case ride. Livestock bison are not at all domesticated or tame and just as dangerous as wild bison. Guests were also given a Lexus to drive while they visited, since most of them flew in, often on private jets. The amount of car accidents was unbelievable, usually involving ice in winter or people backing into trees, or in one instance, 2 cars being used by the same group were totaled when one backed into another at a high rate of speed. We also had guided ATV and UTV rides. People rolled ATVs and UTVs a lot after completely ignoring safety debriefings. Ketamine was very popular among a lot of our guests, and I think was involved in a lot of the recreational vehicles accidents. Buying an entire property just to serve as a high-end storage unit for paintings is a unique way to handle an art collection. It really highlights the difference between seeing a house as a home and seeing it as just another piece of logistics. Story 65. My wife worked for a lady who ran a reading tutoring business for rich parents. The lady was pretty out of touch. Everyone who worked for her was a grad student, and she thought she was being charitable by giving them the opportunity. At Christmas, she wasn't going to process payroll because she was traveling, and it would be a hassle. She was legitimately befuddled when my wife explained to her that people depended on this income. It's winter, and you need food and heat, FEQS. She said, I thought this was all pocket change and fun money. These poor grad students got like 17K a year through school and took on tutoring for $20 an hour to make ends meet. She also took convincing that they needed to get paid for time spent doing emails and lesson prep and things outside of the direct tutoring session. Meanwhile, she charged like $160 an hour or something and complained how hard it was to own 2 houses. Story 66. The general insistence that their success was 100, connected to their hard work, merit, intelligence, etc. No concept of starting life on third base, all of underpaid minions that made it possible, or simply several strokes of good luck. Story 67. My company used to work for the Annenbergs, who created TV Guide and other things. Staff had to call Mr. Annenberg master. He also had a custom ice maker to make his ice cubes for his gin and tonic that was served to him every day at the same time. Answer: I used to work as a surveyor in the desert in California and worked near the Annenberg estate. Once had to recover a property corner adjacent to their property, but got chased off by the cops, even though we had every right to be there and even right to trespass if necessary to perform the survey. Usually we call the cops if we get threatened or chased off, so I didn't know what to do. Called my boss and he told me to forget about it. Who knows who might have been staying there at the time and wasn't worth the hassle. Story 68. My father-in-law ran a business. He once mentioned how most of his employees didn't even have health insurance. His employees, that worked for him full-time, didn't even have health insurance. Story 69. A woman once complained how her 6-bedroom estate was so scary because sometimes she didn't know where in it her children were. Story 70. I don't work for any rich people. I work for myself and am definitely not rich. But I just delivered a used ice maker to a rich dude today that he bought from me on FB. He was out of town for a week but gave me a deposit to hold it for him till he got back. This is a basically half-size commercial ice machine, needs to be plumbed in, etc. When he sent me his address today, I was thinking he didn't understand what he bought because the address was a fancy house on the fancy butte in the fancy part of town. He asked me to deliver it not too far from my restaurant, so fine. I show up, go through the lock gate, and knock on his full copper doors. He comes out and says he's from Florida, we're on the West Coast, and he just loves ice. He told me at his Florida home, he has an ice machine and 2 fridges with ice machines. Here he has an ice machine, 2 more fridges with ice machines, and that he's going to put this one downstairs. The best part was him saying, I've got crushed ice, cubed ice, round ice, basically everything. So now he gets another type of round ice. Super nice guy, but what a hobby. Answer: this one made me laugh. My mom has an ice addiction, and she's thrilled with the 2 kinds of ice her refrigerator makes. For holiday meals with lots of people, she sends my dad to Sonic for the good ice. I was telling someone, I thought my brother lived in luxury because he has a garage refrigerator that is just for drinks. He lives in AZ, so hydration is important. My dad salvaged 2 dorm refrigerators and I took them to work. My coworker and I now both have mini fridges for our seltzer water. We think we are super fancy. I think it's good that something like fancy ice and cold drinks can make everyone so happy. Your rich guy is a little extreme, but I would totally go to an ice tasting party at his house. It seems like a fairly wholesome enthusiasm. Story 71. Was at a very wealthy friend's 5-year-old birthday. A little girl was searching for someone. She seemed upset. I asked if she was looking for her mom. She said, no, my nanny. My mom is on a yacht in Malta. Story 72. Why haven't you bought a house yet? Meanwhile, this was in LA where the housing market is stupidly expensive. Then she said, my grandson has one already, so why shouldn't you? Meanwhile, I was working a minimum wage job and she must have forgotten that she told me she helped her grandson buy his house. Ha! Story 73. Second degree here, but owner of a company flew their family to a Caribbean island during a hurricane to avoid having to deal with it. Then while the hurricane was battering our city, called their nanny personal assistant, who was hunkering down and weathering the storm to have them call the resort the family was staying at, to arrange things like spa massages, meal sets. Answer: owner of a company flew their family to a Caribbean island during a hurricane to avoid having to deal with it. I mean, kind of wild, but if I had the means, I'd probably do it too. Called their nanny personal assistant, who was hunkering down and weathering the storm to have them call the resort the family was staying at to arrange things like spa massages, meals, sick. Oak, never mind. These are horrible people. Story 74. When they throw parties for their friends, there's no expense spared. When it comes to staff and pay, it's a different story. Trying to pay as little as possible. Putting them on 1099s. Not paying for holidays. Not giving them pay raise to keep up with inflation. I work for a wealthy family. Generations of trust fund money. And after 7 hours on the same rate I asked for a raise because everything was gone so expensive. You would think that I kidnapped their newborn. They barely spoke to me for weeks after, and I had to keep pushing the issue and was ready to walk until they finally gave it to me. But yeah, been cheapskates with their staff. Story 75. Didn't work for but went to school with. At the time, we were 14, 15 and the 2008 recession hit. My friend lives on an estate. They had 4 Bentleys, 4 SUVs, and a bunch of other cars. There were 3 kids, and each had a security guard that doubled as their chauffeur. Dad was a property guy, so 2008 took a hit to his business. Mom was a say-he-am. They sold the estate and many of the cars. One day, someone asked her if she wanted to come to the cinema. She screamed at us. She didn't even know where her next meal was coming from, so no, she couldn't afford to go to the cinema. A short while after this, she had a party at the new house they moved to. She lived in a 1.5 mil house in a private community. Average house price in our city was probably around 150, 200K. Still had 2 of the cars, and Dad was mostly spending his time at their holiday home in Spain. The basement was full of liquor that cost more than my parents' annual salary, and the mum was still a say-him. Real tear-jerking poverty. Story 76. They have 3 kids with 2 in high school simultaneously at $68,000 per kid per year. One still to get into high school yet. They don't think it's expensive. The poors in their family are paying $38,000 for a regular prep school. To them, anything less than $50,000, $60,000 per year per kid is basic and middle class. Scarsdale, NY. Edit. Let me elaborate. In the suburbs of places like Philadelphia, prep schools are $30,000, $40K all day and night. Malvern Prep, Salesianum in Delaware, serves Philly. And once you get to the real wealthy suburbs of NYC, it's off the charts, and over $50K is not odd. And it's not even the most expensive option for your kids. If you are really trying for your kids, they're in some European football camps in Europe, going to school and getting room and board at a private boarding house, and you're paying for travel. And for the kids to travel home every holiday or more. 100K a year goes fast like that. So one thing I've been doing for 10 years now is working for people who are billionaires or other poors who only make 500K, 1,000 per year, and the latter say they cannot afford to live. Half the husbands are near tragic end. The other half have ice in their veins. You need to sleep at night while you have more IRS battles than you can count, 3 lawsuits in flight, and you have liens on you all over the place because you fight the irrigation company, the building contractor, the landscaper, your brother, your uncle, etc. They sue. No one shows. Court slaps a lien on you. I am so tired of listening to people fight for money, screw people over, especially family, and beg like they're destitute, and the husband and wife are each making 350 here. Billionaires move past the drama that the poors making 1 million have because they are clear and far away from everyone. So LMAO, it's a weird, weird world. It's the only one they know, and you can't say how the F is $1 million a year not enough. The assumption that everyone has a second home for the season is a classic example of living in a bubble. It's not just about the money, but the genuine confusion that other lifestyles even exist outside of your own social circle. Story 77. My old boss wanted 2 papers every day, something like the Miami Herald and the Financial Times, whilst on his yacht, big yacht. If the local hotels didn't have them, a crew member would have to go and get them. Once someone had to fly from St. Martin to Guadalupe for a copy of the Miami Herald. He would also book out a whole restaurant if he wanted to eat out, so he could have dinner at dinner time in his personal time zone wherever he was in the world. He traveled with a personal doctor, hairdresser, and masseuse as his immediate entourage. Story 78. I work in a dementia ward where most nurses are paid the lowest you can legally pay people. And our CEO released a monthly newsletter, which features him on his custom-made Harley-Davidson, or his yacht, or at the World Cup. He gives these out-of-touch updates about his life and successes. One time we all went on strike, and his newsletter was another image of himself looking sad, standing outside his mansion with his family, boo-hooing that we were behaving so badly, even though we were the lowest paid staff in this industry, in this country. Watched him get fatter and fatter, redder and redder in the face. Left there years ago, but have friends who say he still does that. Story 79. I once had a boss who installed a turntable in his garage, just so he wouldn't have to reverse out of his driveway. Story 80. Not sure this out touch in a bad way. Just not normal reality for 99.999 of the world. For a brief time, I held part ownership of motorcycle business that also sold custom bikes. Clients would fly in from Europe and across the states to rent bikes and ride in the mountains. One group of 4 showed up without a reservation and we had no bikes available. We were trying to figure something out when they saw the custom bikes, which we are not for rent. They asked how much. They started around 33K. They vaguely haggled and bought 130K of custom bikes on the spot. Had to charge them extra because the main guy used an Amex Black Card to buy them. They also wanted someone to follow them and bring all their luggage and the almost 6K in riding gear, helmets, and sunglasses they bought. One of the shop hands ended up renting a big SUV and followed them through the Rockies for 8 days. They paid for the rental SUV, his hotels, all FB, and gave him 5K in cash when they returned. Once they got back, they asked if they could store the bikes at our business until they could figure out what to do with them, as they were from Belgium. Sure. They sat there for 9 months before the main guy even returned an email. He asked if we could just buy them back, but I offered to sell them on consignment, which he was fine with. He told me to try for 20K each and we could keep the rest. Made over 10K on each bike and had his 80K in an account for another year before he finally got back to me again. Told me he had just finished a week-long race from Paris to Drakkar and that he would be in the States in a month and would come collect his money. 3 weeks later, he texted me about having the 80K paid to him in cash and if I could bring it to our FBO airport the next day. I did just that, got to the airport with 80K in cash and waited. His private plane landed, I was escorted out to the tarmac and was invited into the plane. Saw Lawrence for the first time in almost 2 years. We shook hands, I gave him the money, and he opened one of the 5K bands and handed me back a small stack of 100s, which ended up be 1,400. He was so gracious that we were able to accommodate him and his friends 18 months earlier. My business ended up making close to 50K from that encounter. I Google him once in a while and he shows up as a participant in some super exotic car racing circuit in Europe of Africa, or he is pictured with some F1 racers. Crazy life he must have. Returning food because the interior color doesn't coordinate with the room's decor is certainly a bold move. It's hard to tell if that's a deep commitment to aesthetics or just a complete lack of understanding of how bakeries actually operate. Story 81. I did some temp work for a bank. One of the VPs proudly told us how he hired someone to assemble his model railway. Story 82. I worked for a family whose son was going on his first date at 15 years old. They let him use the chauffeur and limo to take her to dinner and gave him their credit card. The staff of 9 had a lottery of who could come closer to how much he spent on dinner. 15 years old, so no adult beverage on the bill. No one was close. Take a guess. 855, and this was 20 years ago. Story 83. I had a friend who owned a limousine service. I would drive for them on occasion. A regular customer was a college student going to school in Colorado whose parents lived in Dubai. Every other weekend, I would pick the kid up on a Friday and drive him to the airport where his parents had their private jet to fly him home for the weekend. I usually picked him back up Monday afternoons or evening. They paid very well, so I didn't mind doing it. By the way, the kid was usually tipsy when I picked him up on Friday. Story 84. I didn't work for this woman, but she did frequent the fabric store I worked at. She would come in weekly, usually on Monday, and buy thousands of dollars of our best fabrics. Unrelated to the story, but she was a lovely older black woman who called me sugar and baby nonstop, and I miss that. Anyway, after a bit, I asked her what she was using all of the fabric for. She hosted dinner parties and used them as tablecloths. After the party was over, she'd throw them away and buy more for next week's party. Story 85. I used to work as an electrician. We installed lighting and ceiling lamps. The owners chose a lampshade made of a material that couldn't be touched without gloves. Otherwise, the acid produced by the human body would burn an indelible mark. Each lampshade cost around $4,100. They had over 30 of them. And to make matters worse, they couldn't be cleaned with regular gloves, only with special gloves. Each pair cost around $1,530. Sorry for my English. Story 86. Didn't work for, but was engaged to one. I had to teach her how to make her own bed and do her own laundry. She thought true poverty, her words, was not something in first world countries, but that people were just bad with money. She grew up in a bubble of other rich people. I was her first non-rich friend and eventual partner. She was not a bad person by any means, just extremely sheltered. She changed drastically after meeting me and experiencing some real-world shock, her words. I had her live on my budget for 2 weeks, and it truly changed her perspective and gave her a lot of empathy. We didn't work out, but are still friends. One of the few rich people I admire because she uses her wealth to help others in need. Answer. A girl in my college class was very proud that she'd never made a bet in her life. She wasn't ultra-rich, but her family was well off, and they were the new rich types. She was all about buying stuff from big brands and flaunting her designer bag and shoes. The girl in the class who lived in the same private condo as her was old money and a lot more easygoing, had an old phone that was barely holding it together and drove an old car because she didn't care about stuff and didn't bother replacing anything until it broke for good. Story 87. I've been a property manager for rich folks to basically check on their fancy houses they don't ever live in. I had one client who wanted me to decorate their vacation home in the country for the holidays and stock the fridge just in case they want to stay there. The never came, though, and they never realized that it was basically my vacation home the entire time I worked for them. Story 88. I did my boss's travel plans, expense reports, and also paid his personal bills. Last check of the day was wife's weekly allowance. Story 89. I was working for a caterer doing an in-home party. The homeowner said it must be so fun for you to go into people's homes and see their nice stuff. Oh yes, it's a real thrill for us poors. Answer. In high school, I worked for a florist. It was crazy setting up the at-home weddings. I lived in a shoreline town, so there was a lot of money there. There was a delivery that I still think about. It wasn't a wedding. It was just a Friday night, and a butler dressed up in his tux answered the door to accept the delivery. The house was a massive stone mansion in the woods. Story 90. I saw an interview of a Saudi prince who never had to buy anything for himself. The reporter asked, how much does he think a bottle of water cost? This was late 90s, I believe. And he shrugged and said, no, 500 or something like that. I was like, I should go there and sell water to Saudi princes. Story 91. I was landscaping a garden and a member of the full-time house staff came over to me and said he was feeling weird all of a sudden. I brought him to the kitchen and told him to sit down. I found the homeowner and said, I think he's having a stroke, and to call for an ambulance. They then started to Google the number for a hospital. I said, just call 999, and they looked so confused. Story 92. Freshman college roommate was raised with help in the house and did not expect or know how to clean up after herself. It was a spendy private school. She eventually got the hang of it and was quite tickled with herself. I was able to be a student there via a sports scholarship. I taught her how to make her bed, buy soap, etc., and do laundry. Oh, yay. Story 93. A client once said, why don't you just buy a house in the city? It's only $2 million. I was making $15 an hour. Story 94. I worked for the wealthy guy who owned the company. I was his personal assistant and did a whole variety of things. He decided to go on an unplugged vacation, a fishing trip where they took you out by helicopter and came back in 6 weeks to get you. He was shocked to discover, when he came back, that the office was empty and we'd all started looking for other jobs because we hadn't gotten paid. Story 95. My ex-husband worked on Bill Gates' Seattle Medina mansion. At the time, it was the most expensive home in the area. The family had Bill's birthday party on the construction site. They shut it down and converted it into a 9-hole golf course for his birthday party. Each hole was a personal memory theme. The one I remember was at the pool they craned in Bill's Shelby Mustang as a prop. Another one was a giant Scrabble board. I still have a giant letter R. It took 2 weeks to set it up, then 3 days for the party, then another week to tear down. They did give the workers a day for a party to play the course and a BBQ. There are lots of stories about excessive on that house. Story 96. She chartered a private jet to send her dog from West Palm Beach to Tampa to the dog groomer she liked. She insisted that it be a larger plane with a flight attendant so the dog wouldn't be lonely or uncomfortable on the 30-minute flight. Story 97. A wealthy woman living in a mansion who decided she loved chickens. Are you aware that you can buy diapers for your chickens so they don't shoot on your 24,000 couch? Story 98. Earlier in my career, I installed the Wi-Fi in the CEO of a Fortune 50 company's home. It took 16 access points to cover the square footage of the main house, with 3 being for density coverage in a conference room, formal dining room, ballroom type setup, not sure what to call it. He had 3 network closets in his home. He also had entirely separate business circuits built out to his house from multiple carriers, redundancy, so he could work from home. This was 2016-ish. This didn't include the residential circuits to each house on the property. The guest house on the property took another 6 access points. Pool house had another 3. Biggest residence I've ever seen, and I guarantee that guy probably had rooms in his house he didn't know existed. Story 99. I worked at a company where the payroll went out late a few times in 3 months. This wasn't a cash flow problem. The owners just didn't care enough to submit payroll on time. An entry-level employee sent an email to the entire staff saying she wouldn't be coming into work until she was paid. I then received an email from the owner of the company asking for a list of employees that need to be paid on time. Answer. This reminds me of when our payroll was submitted almost a week late, with overtime calculated incorrectly, I might add, for 2 pay periods in a row, and I complained about how this was putting me behind in bills to my direct boss who had both extreme familial wealth and made 100K a year. His response to this was to tell me that I was financially stupid for not having at least 3 months' worth of expenses saved up, and that any intelligent person would not be screwed over by late pay. Unrelated, but he also berated me for having a miscarriage at my desk once. Guy was a real peach. Story 100. I used to be valet at this really fancy business company. Porches every day. This guy told me I could take it for a spin without a single worry in the world. Trusting a stranger with your luxury care is insane. I also used to work at a private preschool that charged the parents like $1,000 a week. Your child is not learning any curriculum yet. We're just feeding them and letting them run around outside. Answer. I married into a wealthy family, and my father-in-law would let just about anyone drive his Porsches because he didn't think of them as luxury cars. Those were his daily drivers. The 1960-something DB5 was his luxury car. Sorry, I'm not a car guy. I don't know the exact year or model. He wouldn't let anyone else sit in it except his wife. He's bought a few Ferraris over the years that he'd have shipped to tracks for track days with his sons and then sell them after a year. I think he'd rather crash a Ferrari than let the DB5 get a scratch. Dude is less worried about me dropping his granddaughter, my daughter, than he is that I'd hurt that car if I got too close to it. But a Porsche? Pfft. He could buy a new one tomorrow if I wrecked one. Story 101. By definition, I am wealthy now, but I worked for a billionaire once and became friendly with the couple. His wife invited my wife and I to Hawaii. I thought she meant in a few months, she meant tomorrow. Just pop off in our jet and join her. At the time, I was working a real corporate job with intense responsibilities for her husband. She was a kept woman trophy bride. Her husband came to dislike her and divorced, giving her only 10M. Story 102. I worked at an organization that would throw a large fundraiser every year. I was in charge of all the behind-the-scenes work on it and would spend hours beyond my normal job time each day making sure everything was on track. The last year I worked there, the board chairperson thanked me at a meeting, made a big speech about how everyone there knew how much extra time I spend on the event each year and how it would be impossible to do without me. She said how everyone on the board, all very wealthy people, had chipped in to get me a thank you gift to show how much they appreciated me. It was a Christmas ornament. Total cost was maybe $30, so each person chipped in maybe $3 to show their appreciation. I realized they didn't have to acknowledge me at all, but what a slap in the face that all my extra efforts were only worth a few dollars in their eyes. Story 103. I sell commercial overhead door stuff. A rich guy on 3 occasions offered us extra money to get his job done faster. Aside from the fact that we don't do that, the first time he expressed a hurry, I told him the slide door operator that he ordered was on back order from the manufacturer. It's an odd application and it's not something they stock, and it took almost 2 months to get. I even gave him an option for something sooner, which would have just been a modified trolley operator. He wanted the sliding door specific operator. It was a sliding door on a barn. He wanted it ready for a party. If he didn't have it in time, he'd have to manually slide it in front of his guests. I ended up hating this guy. No amount of money was going to get that motor any faster. And I feel like the fact that his money didn't get him an immediate yes broke his brain on 3 different occasions. His maintenance guy called multiple times a week to ask if it was in and tell me how unhappy the customer was. We went there and installed it the day after it arrived. The day after that, I heard about a complaint from my boss, and this guy wanted to see my communications with the manufacturer proving what I had said. I don't even know what his goal was with that, to get me in trouble, I guess. I told the truth the whole time, so there was no issue for me aside from wanting to punch this rich old fudge. There's a profound irony in complaining about the sounds of a life-saving facility while undergoing a voluntary procedure. It's a stark reminder of how a focus on personal comfort can sometimes completely overshadow the reality of what's happening to others nearby. Story 104. $1 million home that I was cat-sitting at. The smoke detector battery dies. I can't change the battery as it's on a vaulted ceiling. Homeowner requested I call the fire department, thinking they'd change the battery as a social civil act. Oh, did I mention it's the 4th of July and there's a city festival going on? No, the fire department doesn't want to come and deal with this. Story 105. I was told if your problem can be solved with money, it's not a problem. I remember just thinking about how my bank account was in the negatives. Answer. Well, sometimes the time gained is worth more than the money you'll spend. Like there's a wash and fold laundry service that I've utilized when depressed, and it was definitely worth the money to pay 85 for 60 loads of laundry to be washed and folded, with fabric softener returned to my doorstep. Existential dread has a price, and I was willing to pay it. Story 106. Received a call from BMW that his i8 was ready for collection, and he went, "Did I buy one? What color is it?" Story 107. No, you can't have a raise because I just bought a new house and the pool's expensive to maintain. The pool was bigger than my apartment. It was at that point I knew I had to leave. Story 108. Doing a tiling job for a wealthy family. Tiled their enormous living room floor, kitchen floor, and walls. Expensive materials. Expensive job. They asked if we would accept some rare roosters from their chicken coop as part payment. They are very valuable, but quite aggressive. Yeah, nah. Story 109. I nannied for a wealthy family in my early 20s, and it was the lack of actual parenting that I remember most. For instance, the youngest child had behavioral issues, and I took him to his therapy appointments instead of his actual parents. Without going into much detail, I had a knife pulled on me during an overnight stay, and I quit that following morning. Story 110. I worked for a wealth management firm owned by a very wealthy man. I arrived at the office an hour before he did and before we opened to prep the office for his arrival. It was a whole thing. Most of these tasks were strange, but the one that always stuck out to me was the thing with the blinds. He wanted all the blinds to be raised lowered to the exact same height as those in his office. However, he left them the day before. I would use a ruler to check the height of his blinds and then go make all the others match. And they all had to be angled exactly the same. I also baked cookies because he liked the smell of baking cookies. Didn't matter if anyone ate them, he wanted to smell cookies. Story 111. Imported a special Jamin slicer from Spain for the legs of a barraco they would always have on hand. The slicer was a woman, a full adult human being they brought to America and set up near their beach house in the Hamptons just to cut ham. Story 112. An ex-employer literally thought that I was working there for fun and that my paychecks were just expendable income. Answer: a number of years ago, I was interviewing to be an IT service technician at a development company run by a billionaire and his wife. There were like 15 people in total at the company, and I'm interviewing with both the husband and wife. Over the course of the interview, I discovered there was no other IT personnel at the office. I'd be the only one, and their expectations were pretty low. But the most eye-opening part was when we started talking money. Wife: so how much do you see yourself getting paid here? Me: I was making $30 an hour at my last company, as I'd be more or less the only IT staff here, and I'd be handling everything. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for 35. Wife: oh, I was expecting a yearly salary. What's that equate to, like 150K? Husband: no, honey, that's like 180K. Me: nods quietly. Got the job. Had it for around 8 months before they shuttered the company and moved to France. I made 100K doing shoot like resetting the in-office router, configuring SharePoint, and creating a company-wide email signature template. It was the easiest money I ever made. There's a massive disconnect when someone who pays a low hourly wage expects their employee to have the same financial flexibility as they do. Suggesting a major purchase like a new car as a quick fix really highlights a lack of awareness regarding the cost of living. Story 113. I'm Australian and we like to travel and we get 4 weeks vacation. It's common for young Australians to quit their job and travel for 2 years. I've been with my company for 5 years. It took 2 years to save enough money to buy an airline ticket to Europe and enough money to travel for 3 weeks. My American boss didn't understand why I was taking a 3-week vacation to Europe and suggested I go for 2 weeks and go back later in the year for another. Story 114. I once worked as a housemaid cook for minor nobility in England in the 1980s. He was the noble she married in. She would ring a little bell to get me to climb up 2 stories to pass her a handkerchief from the other side of the bed. She never got up before midday. She sacked me suddenly after hiring a cheap young girl from Lancashire to become nursemaid housemaid cook. The poor girl had no idea what she was getting into. Rather than pay me out, her ladyship made up a whole lot of complaints and kicked me out that day. It left me broke and alone and very far from home. I am an Aussie, but I managed, just another backpacking adventure. And before I left, I made sure to go out to their garden shed and unplug their freezer where that season's pheasants were stored. Story 115. 2 teenage twerps talk about the difference between first class and business class airfare when all they knew was private Story 116. My sister was a house manager for a billionaire. Their adult daughter in her 40s lived at home. When they traveled, my sister did all of the packing for the daughter because she had no idea how to pack a suitcase. Story 117. I'm a plumber. In the middle of COVID, I was hired to do some work on a huge 11-bedroom home in the mountains that had been left vacant for many years and needed a complete renovation. The guy who owned the house decided he wanted to project manage it and be super hands-on. So he hired all of the subcontractors individually and put us to work. While repairing certain aspects of the plumbing, we opened up drywall for access. He had a drywall guy on site and didn't want him sitting around doing nothing. So the drywall guy would come behind us and repair it, although we told him we'd still need access the next day or the day after that. The drywall guy was patching the same hole 2 or 3 times a week. The same guy had a bike accident and had to have his foot in a cast for a few weeks and bought himself a fully loaded Jeep Gladiator too, and I quote, cheer himself up.